The Intercept's Ken Klippenstein and Sarah Sirota report that the United States military's biometric collection and identification devices were seized last week by the Taliban, putting coalition partners' iris scans, fingerprints, and more at risk of exposure. Biometric data on Afghans who assisted the U.S. was widely collected and used in identification cards, according to sources, though it's still unclear how much of the data has been compromised. Investigative reporter at The Intercept, Ken Klippenstein, joins us now to discuss. Ken, terrific reporting. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you guys.
So what's your sense of how much access to this data the Taliban will now have?
So there are different databases, and it's sort of complicated how much information they have. Past reporting suggests that the coalition, particularly the U.S. government, was trying to collect biometric data on 80% of Afghans. So it was pretty much a hoover it all up effort. And one of the risks of that, and a certain outlet that you might have heard of called the Intercept tried to draw attention to this years ago, is that when you collect all that data, there's a risk that it can get out. And as I interviewed people for the story, I quote the chief technology officer of Human Rights First. He says it seems as though there was no thought put into data security whatsoever. And that would seem to be bad if you're collecting, uniquely identifying information like fingerprints, iris scans, and biographical data that could now tell the Taliban what it was that people were doing. And in many cases, these might have been coalition partners, people that were helping us on the ground, translators, things of that nature.
Well, and this just goes to the point that we've been, raising hell over on this show of why was there no effort made before this withdrawal to protect basic things, whether it's U.S. weaponry, U.S. citizens, Afghan citizens who helped the U.S., but then also their data. Was there any indication in your reporting that there was an attempt by the U.S. government to secure this? How did it fall into the wrong hands?
Yeah, so while I was interviewing current and former military for the story, I said to them, there's got to be some kind of kill switch or something, right? And again, they would say, I wouldn't assume that. And I would say, why is that? They said, well, these contractors, they get money either way. And so, this device, HIDE, stands for Handheld Interagency Identification Equipment, is sort of emblematic of the failure of that conflict, which is that we lavished, tens of millions of dollars on these HIDE equipment manufacturers. And, once they get their money, of what concern is it to them, on what terms we leave? And so the impression I get is that it just wasn't a priority for these companies that don't have the same sets of interests that, the U.S. government or U.S. taxpayers do. And so there may well have been no sort of kill switch. In any case, the Taliban can certainly access what exists on local storage of these devices. And what I'm told by folks in the special operations community is that there are concerns that either the Chinese or the Pakistani intelligence, which is much more sophisticated than what the Taliban can do, might be able to help them access broader remote databases via these devices. So there's all sorts of concerns, and unfortunately doesn't seem to have been a commensurate level of worry over how to secure these devices in the event that something like this happens.
So Ken, you said that they were collecting this biometric data on 80% of Afghans, like the entire country was having this data?
Reportedly, that's the goal that the Pentagon set out, which just means everybody. And at first, when they were selling these devices, it was pitched to the Pentagon, to the public, as, this is to track insurgents, this is to track terrorists. And of course, there's mission creep, and pretty soon you're just gathering everything that you can on everybody.
And by the way, I would just note Jennifer Griffin from Fox News, Pentagon reporter, was tweeting out from sources on the ground that the Taliban's already going door to door to round up Afghan special forces. And they do have themselves documentation of who some of these individuals are, but I would imagine having this further data is going to help them be able to track who was a translator, who was an interpreter, who served and co-located with the U.S. military. So we're already seeing real-life repercussions for this data falling into the wrong hands.
Yeah, that's precisely the kind of data these things include. So it's not just the irises and fingerprints, they include biographic data. One source, a U.S. military contractor, showed me an ID card that they have that spells out some of this information. It shows who they're in the employ of, which U.S. military base they report to. Really sensitive stuff that, can lead to really scary forms of retribution. And there are reports now on the ground that the Taliban are actually using this equipment to do exactly that.
What a nightmare. So you're saying that basically when the Taliban are able to round up these folks, that then when they go into questioning, and of course many of them are going to want to deny what their role was if they're sitting in the hands of the Taliban, and they won't really be able to, because they're going to be able to look it all up and say, well, actually, we already have your fingerprints and your iris scans, and we know exactly who you were. I mean, this just seems like a disaster.
Yeah, it's very Silicon Valley, producing solutions to problems that don't exist. I mean, why do we need this, massive database if we can have something on paper or whatever it might be? Well, I'll tell you one reason why, because a certain group of people can make a whole lot of money off of it, and that's what happens. And, that is a large factor of the failure here, is this sort of market free-for-all where there was just tons of government money out there for contractors. And unfortunately, I think that's what that's one of the priorities of this conflict that superseded what really mattered, which was establishing a functional government.
And actually, Julian Assange made this point back in 2011, and he was saying that the goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the U.S. and back through Europe and back into the hands of the American wealthy elites. Let's take a listen to this clip from Assange from 2011.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
And Ken, any broader lessons on mass surveillance that you think can be drawn from this incident?
Yeah, start from the assumption that the information you're gathering could end up getting out. They have a saying in the InfoSec, information security world, which is that design things so that they fail well. Assume that it will fail, assume that something will go wrong, and then in that case, design it so that that failure won't be catastrophic. In the case of these hide devices, exactly the opposite is what happened. They were designed to fail poorly, which is that a data failure is catastrophic and is going to be able to, allow this essentially reactionary medieval political force to identify people who, they think were working against their interests and exact retribution. There appears to have been zero effort whatsoever to make it so that, if this data is penetrated, that they didn't try to anonymize it, they didn't try to locate it, and they didn't put different layers of security over it, which you often do if this is something that you're seriously worried about. But it seems like what they were worried about is making a whole lot of money. So
well, I also worry that this is going to be something that is rolled out to the American public. So this is, the military testing things or on foreigners, but then they roll it out here. And clearly, if they were doing this, if they were trying to collect the data on 80%, at this point had gotten to 80% of the Afghan population, maybe with the whole idea of, well, we're trying to track terrorists. Well, now I can see a scenario where this is used in the United States because of needing to track domestic terrorists. Is that something that seems like it might be where these contractors were headed?
Yeah, a lot of these things tend to come home. The funding for the research and development of these things tends to start out in the state sector, and then they end up rolling it out in the private consumer sector. So in the case of biometric data, this is something all of our iPhones are capable of doing right now, when they have the Face ID scan. That's all being stored somewhere. Now, I haven't seen evidence that they're sharing that with, government partners or anything like that. But, there's a tendency for there to be mission creep. And like I was saying before, you should start from the assumption that, things can go wrong and that these things can get out. And so, certainly that's a possibility, and that's the direction in which these things can go.
Yeah,
and Ken, sorry.
No, the shock at this kind of reminds me of Democrats who were totally fine with mass surveillance when Obama was president, but then all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, the Trump administration now has access to this technology?
And now the Taliban.
Right. And one quick point I just want to make, because you made a good point about, the Taliban doesn't have necessarily the most sophisticated technology and intelligence operation to be able to use this data well. But who does is the Chinese. The Chinese who are already recognizing the Taliban government, who, mark my words, are going to have operations in reconstructing Afghanistan, and who would love to have this sort of data on the Afghani people. We know that they collect it on Americans. They own the holding company that owns 23andMe, which people willingly send their DNA into. This is something the Chinese have been doing for the last decade, is collecting as much biometric data as they can on global citizens around the world. And I'm sure they'll be eager to get their hands on this from the Afghan people.
Yeah, those might be the innovators par excellence of, internal state surveillance. I mean, look at what they've done within their own country, and now what they're going to be able to do here. And then the agency that I heard brought up again and again was the Pakistani intelligence. It's called the Inter-Service Intelligence, ISI. These guys are really sophisticated. So to the extent that the Taliban doesn't have the resources to do anything, those guys certainly do, and the Chinese certainly do too.
Yeah, no doubt. Ken, terrific reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we will have more Rising right after this.